Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Welfare Wednesday webinar, looking at trauma in horses, a neuroscience perspective. Please bear with us just for a few seconds while we connect to Facebook Live. And we are now connected to Facebook. So welcome to everyone on Facebook and on Zoom. As always, we're really pleased to see so many of you attending these webinars. You can continue to support World Horse Welfare and ultimately horse welfare in so many ways, with one easy way being encouraging your family and friends to take part in these webinars as well. Anyone can register on Zoom for free, which we feel is the best way to participate, but you can also watch live on Facebook. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch back at a later date, and a link should now be available in the chat. Our next webinar on the 27th of March will be following the Days of the Lives of Horses at 2 Olympians Yards. We're going to be delighted to be joined by Sam Griffiths and Richard Davison to take a look at how they manage their horses with positive welfare in mind. But as I mentioned earlier, tonight we are joined by Emma Lethbridge and Justine Harrison to discuss trauma in horses. Welcome both. We want you to be involved. This is very much a two-way conversation, so please use the Q&A tab on Zoom and pop any questions in the Facebook comments if you're watching on Facebook. If you are using Zoom, please remember to upvote the questions, because in the audience Q&A at the end, we will be going through the most upvoted questions first. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please attend the other webinars and share any links with your friends. And we are always open to ideas for future topics for webinars, and you can send any ideas you may have to education@worldhorsewelfare.org. So I just need to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. So we're going to kick off with a poll question, which Basil will launch for those who are watching in Zoom. I'm afraid you can't answer if you're on Facebook, but you're more than welcome to pop your answer in the Facebook comments, so we can see what you guys are thinking as well. So the question is, do you think you have owned or worked with a horse with trauma? So if you're happy to pop your answers in there, and whilst you are doing that, I will introduce Emma. So Emma has studied horses to master's level and has a degree in neuroscience and attained a PhD in neuropsychology. She's ridden in affiliated competitions, worked on professional yards, directed an equine learning centre, taught riding, and helped many people with their horses' behaviour. Emma contributes to the online learning platform Understand Horses, and I absolutely love this statement in your bio, Emma. She's come to love equines not for what they can do for us, but for the wonderful creatures they are in their own right. And as ever, we asked our panelists for a quirky story or an interesting fact, and Emma's is that she likes to write speculative fiction in her spare time. So Emma, have you ever published anything?
Yeah, I've got a few things out.
Oh, very exciting. So I'm just going to stop sharing, and then hopefully Basil will be able to pull up the poll results. So an overwhelming yes, 87% of you think you have owned or worked with a horse with trauma, 7% no, and 6% not sure. I think that's really interesting to see going into your presentation, Emma. So going to hand over to Emma. And
right, I'm just going to share my screen. Welcome, everyone. Remember to share my sound this time. Right, hopefully it's displaying okay for everyone. So I'm hopefully going to talk a little bit tonight about how we recognize trauma in our horses. And I'm obviously talking about psychological trauma. People talk about physical as well, which is why we have called it a neuroscience perspective. So we're going to be looking at the effect of trauma on our equine companions. Rebecca introduced me very well there, but just a little bit more background. So I have both academic and practical qualifications in equine behaviour, and then I'm also a neuroscientist. So I kind of bridge the gap between scientific kind of information and practical horse behaviour and working with horses. So that's kind of my speciality, if you like. They were hoping to kind of talk to you about 3 key things, because this webinar is quite short, so it's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. But we really want to talk about these 3 things primarily. And firstly, that is how we define trauma in horses, the symptoms of trauma that we observe in horses, and then how we can begin to rehabilitate horses who have experienced trauma. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I wanted to introduce one of my very old family ponies, who has sadly passed away many years ago, because really my interest in trauma goes back to this pony. She was primarily my sister's pony, and we bought her from a riding school because she was bought from a dodgy dealer by the riding school. Turned out to be completely inappropriate for riding school, put several people in hospital, but my sister just loved her. And for ages, we just thought kind of she's just like that. But then many years later, after she had calmed down, we started thinking, well, maybe there was something psychologically going on. I was only a teenager at this point, so it wasn't a kind of fully formed thought process. And we eventually met her old owner. And her old owner said, no, she used to be, lively, but not ever aggressive, not ever nasty, just lively. She was a Welsh D. We know they can be a little bit on the lively side. And that made me start thinking, well, if something really nasty had happened at the dealer's yard, she is mimicking the symptoms of trauma that I was learning about through my psychological and neurological studies. So I began to think, well, maybe she had undergone some sort of trauma response similar to PTSD. And that is why she was manifesting these kind of symptoms of extreme kind of fight response. So really my entire interest in this area comes back to that little pony, who kind of all those years ago. Please forgive the lack of hat. I was a teenager in the early 2000s. So let's get into it. What is trauma? How can we define trauma in animals? If you look at definitions of trauma, they have certain things in common. The first one being that there has to be a really unpleasant or stressful experience for the person or animal. That is a kind of key part of trauma. What defines a kind of traumatized horse over a non-traumatized horse that have gone through similar experiences is that the traumatized animal will experience ongoing negative impacts, particularly around emotional processing and around kind of fear learning and areas like that we'll talk about later. But basically, there has to be a really distressing event, and then the animal has to experience ongoing negative issues around kind of emotion processing. And there are 3 core types of trauma, and I feel it is important to know the difference between them, because trauma can manifest in various different ways. So you have 3 key types. The first one is acute trauma. So this is the type of trauma you have if you have, for example, a horse who's had an accident in a horse lorry. There's been one very stressful event. So usually those types of horses, their kind of fear triggers are very specific to that event. They can generalize a little bit beyond it, but usually acute trauma is still not easy to work with, but easier to work with, because the things that will trigger the memories of the trauma for the horse and kind of exacerbate emotional responses are going to be very linked to that event, and you're hopefully going to know what it is. My slides seem to be moving on their own. I don't know why they're doing that, sorry. Secondly, we have chronic trauma. So chronic trauma is ongoing trauma that is experienced over a long period of time. And things like abuse or neglect will fall into this category. And then finally, you have complex trauma. And horses who go through complex trauma experience both kind of chronic stressful events and acute stressful events, and it's a mixture of different things. And they are often the hardest to work with because they have a lot of different triggers of those past memories. It's often hard to know what they all are. And also their emotional responding can be particularly impacted, and their learning can be impacted very heavily. So it's important to kind of know that there are these different types of trauma, and they affect how the horse responds to what they've been through. There are sort of 3 dimensions on which the effects of trauma occur. The first being the kind of neurological and psychological domain, both with regards to emotional processing and cognitive processing in the horse. Because of these changes in the brain, you then get physical changes in how the body of the horse is working, and we'll go through these. And then these manifest as behavior. So you have kind of a cascade, and also these all feed back into each other. It's a big looping feedback system. But there are essentially 3 domains where you get changes due to trauma. So in the horse's brain, when they experience something highly distressing or unpleasant, and this is also true of humans, by the way, and other mammals, there are 2 primary systems which can change and will adapt due to trauma. And really, we think that this was kind of an evolution in order to survive, to promote survival in the horse, by getting them to remember and avoid that experience happening again at all costs, because it usually in trauma is something that is very threatening to your life. So obviously these changes in the systems are to promote survival, but within our kind of husbandry of the horse, they can be extremely detrimental to both the horse's well-being and welfare and to our safety. So these 2 primary systems that get changed are the fear/stress response. And when people say the fear response or the stress response, they're talking about exactly the same biological mechanics. So they're not 2 separate things. It's the same underlying mechanics for both those things. They're just kind of synonyms. The key areas, if you're really into kind of brain science, for the fear system in the brain are the amygdala, and also the hypothalamus, which sits kind of underneath the horse's brain. So hopefully you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? See? So you've got the hypothalamus, which is this color here. And then this is a cut through of the horse's brain. And you can see this area here. This is the hypothalamus. You then also have the amygdala, and you actually have 2 of them. In the limbic system of the horse's brain. So the other system that I said becomes adapted due to trauma is the hypothalamus, which processes memory. And then you can see, sorry, not the hypothalamus, the hippocampus. There we go. In red on this one, the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is responsible for converting short-term to long-term memory, and also the retrieval of memory. And what tends to happen in trauma is that this area of the brain gets adapted. It becomes strongly linked with the amygdala. And you can get things called flashbulb memories occurring, or flashbacks, which are really kind of strong recalls, essentially, of the very stressful event for the horse. And these will trigger very large fear responses. So you get those 2 systems really undergoing quite a lot of change in the traumatized horse. Okay, So this is a picture of the pituitary gland, which is attached to the hypothalamus. Because I just wanted to talk a little bit about the fear response, because the fear response can become quite adapted in a horse that's undergone trauma. So when the horse feels fear, what will occur is the amygdala, which we saw before, will send signals to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus will do two things to generate a fear response in the horse. It will activate the sympathetic nervous system, which sends nerve impulses all the way through the horse's body to ramp up respiration, heart rate, and also to release adrenaline from the adrenal glands. And we've all felt the effects of adrenaline. It's exactly the same for horses. You know, you get that racing heart rate, the increase in blood pressure, you get more kind of blood sugar going, all those sorts of things. A slightly slower response occurs through the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus will also create a cascade of hormones which result in the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. And this cortisol creates a long-term stress response. And in horses that have undergone trauma, it can be a little bit complex, but you can get higher levels of cortisol. And in fact, if those high levels of cortisol occur for too long a period of time, you can even get cortisol fatigue, where the whole system starts to break down. And this affects things like the horse's metabolism, having constant cortisol problems, either too high or too low in the blood, affects the immune system. It affects how we kind of process protein and fats and blood sugar. So it affects the whole of the horse's physiology, both in the short term with the effects of adrenaline and cortisol mixed together, and then longer term if you have the kind of consistent action of cortisol in the horse. So those are the two things you have happen simultaneously on a physical level in the horse when they have undergone trauma. You have changes in the memory system of the brain, and then you have the changes in the stress response, creating physiological changes in the horse's body. And these obviously manifest as behavior. And behavior is how we can spot, as horse owners and carers, potential signs of trauma in our animals. And here I've rounded up, again, this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid. I've rounded up the most common symptoms of trauma. Now, not every horse will show all of these symptoms. And not every, if you have two horses that go through the same thing, even they won't show the same symptoms, because it will be informed by the horse's nature, their genes, and also their nurture, which is everything that happens to them during life and how that affects them physically. So common things that you may see in a horse that has undergone trauma. So number one is an increased startle response because of those adaptations to the fear response. Again, the horse could be restless or spooky, anxious or hypervigilant. Those are all hyperactivity or sensitization of the fear systems. They can become depressed, withdrawn, or helpless. So this is when the horse is showing a kind of stress response, but instead of being hypervigilant, they've gone into being very withdrawn and kind of almost depressive in their psychology. Anhedonia-like behavior. Anhedonia is the lack of enjoyment of anything. And then a common one is actually aggression or irritable behavior. Now, a lot of people often don't realize that it's the fight and flight response. They are all part of a stress response. They're part of a fear response. So again, this is due to that change occurring in the stress response of the horse's brain and body. So if you've got an extremely aggressive horse, don't rule out trauma as being potentially informing that behavior. You can get avoidant behaviors. It's not unusual for horses to avoid their triggers. And you due to the kind of sensitization of the fear systems, you can get very large responses to triggering stimuli. If you've worked with the kind of horses with trauma, you might be ticking these off in your head right now as which ones you see. Number 8 is you can get generalization of triggers. So what we mean by this is if a horse, say, had a really bad experience with a horse lorry, for example, the horse will be looking to avoid anything that reminds them of a horse lorry. So it might start to be kind of anything that sounds like a horse lorry or an engine, or it might be the changes in footing or the feeling of movement. And that's called generalization. So the horse is associating other stimuli with their trigger, and then that stimuli is becoming a trigger in itself. You can get dysfunction of fear extinction. So fear extinction, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically the unlearning of fear. So when you've kind of getting over a fear, essentially. So let's say you have a fear of spiders. If you were to kind of spend enough time in a room with a spider and that fear went away, that would be fear extinction. In horses who have experienced trauma, the research suggests that fear extinction is a much less linear process. So rather than the horse going from feeling fear and then spending time in the presence of that trigger and it going away, what can actually happen is sort of a sensitization, or it's just a very up and down process. And you also get the reoccurrence of those stimuli that you think have undergone extinction. They kind of crop up again a lot more in horses that have had trauma. And we call this the spontaneous recovery of triggers. So you think they've gone, you think the horse has recovered from their fear, but because of that adaptation in the memory system and how it's linked to the fear system now, they can just spontaneously reoccur. Obviously, when you have a particularly active limbic system, what can also occur is that the kind of cortical areas are less able to inhibit and are less active. If you've ever had to take an exam that you were really, really stressed about, you will understand the effect that stress can have on the cortices. So if the horse is in a state of kind of a heightened arousal all the time, that will impair their learning. And along with this comes attention. I'm just going to take a quick drink. Sorry, bear with me. So moving on from kind of psychological symptoms, you may also see disturbances in the horse's sleep. This is one we are less able quite often to observe because we're not with them all the time. But if you never ever see your horse lying down flat out, they're probably not getting enough REM sleep. Because the horse can only go into rapid eye movement sleep, which is REM sleep, which is important for learning and kind of restoration if they are lying flat. So if your horse isn't getting good quality sleep, that can be caused by trauma. Oh dear, sorry, my things are doing it again. You can also get appetite disturbances due to stress. We all know that when we get stressed, it's difficult to eat because your digestive system is being kind of shut down by the adrenaline, essentially, because you've got bigger things to worry about than eating. And then you can get an increase or development of stereotypic behaviors. These are things like weaving or crib biting, those sort of repetitive behaviors that we sometimes see in horses. And then finally, you can get social relationship disturbances. So this would be kind of herd dynamic differences. So that's a really kind of long list, and it will vary massively horse to horse, whether they show a lot of these or just one or two of these. And really, you're just looking for these symptoms after a very stressful event. That would suggest that changes have occurred in the horse's physiology and neurology, which have kind of generated a bit of a trauma response. Now let's talk briefly about what we can start to do with a horse that we feel has undergone trauma and is manifesting some of the symptoms that we've seen before. Talked about before, sorry. So what can we do for these horses? So the first thing is that we need to activate that stress response as little as possible. We need to put the horse in a situation where they feel safe. So the husbandry has to generate a feeling of safety and security in the animal. What we have to remember is that feeling safe is something that comes from inside the horse and not something we can put on them. So as much as we think their environment is lovely, if they don't feel safe, then it doesn't matter. And one of the ways that we can make sure that our horses experience as little stress as possible is by ensuring that we have kind of really excellent husbandry and welfare. The bare minimum being the 3 Fs of forage, friends, and freedom. But a lot of people now use the 5 freedoms or the 5 domains. There's a lot of crossover between these two, and some people prefer one or the other. But essentially, they both want the animal to be have appropriate nutrition, freedom from discomfort due to appropriate environment, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear or distress. And the 5 domains really goes into much more detail on the animals, both their behavior and also their mental state. And also the 5 domains has become more popular because it considers also positive affects, for example, pleasure and comfort, as well as the negative ones that we see in the 5 freedoms. So this is a kind of nice diagram that sums up that kind of ethos of generating an environment for the horse, which is going to trigger that stress response as little as possible. And this is important because if you continually trigger that stress response, you're going to maintain and even worsen those changes that have occurred due to the trauma, and they won't begin to undo themselves. So we need to make sure that every element of the horse's environment is allowing them to feel safe. The second thing we need to do is identify the horse's triggers. So if they've had acute trauma, these might be quite simple and quite limited to whatever their acute trauma was. And you can work with those in a fairly isolated way. If the horse has had very complex trauma, then you can get triggers that are very complex, very generalized, and you have to be much more aware of what those triggers are. And you have to know what they're influenced by and how the horse feels calmed. So that would be your second thing, observing your horse and what symptoms they have and what triggers their responses. One thing to particularly look out for with traumatized animals, because of the sensitized memory and fear systems, is something called trigger stacking, or stimulus stacking, it's sometimes also called. So trigger stacking or stimulus stacking occurs when you have multiple things the horse is afraid of, even if they're fairly minor things that only kind of cause them to be a little bit reactive. But if they occur in reasonably quick succession, the horse hasn't had time to come back down into what we call a parasympathetic response, which returns you to kind of your homeostatic state where you are at kind of optimal function and rest. Then you can get very quickly to the place where the traumatized horse is panicking and not coping anymore. So one key thing with traumatized animals is to look for the triggers stacking up, and you have to be very vigilant with equine behavior, and also knowing your triggers for your horse. And also we need to be giving the horse time to come back into that rested state if you do find them activating, because remember, they are sensitized, so they are likely to have larger and quicker fear responses. So I was just going to talk very quickly finally about two primary ways that people often use to work with triggers in horses. The first being systematic desensitization, and the second being counter conditioning, because these are most effective and reasonably simple. There's a lot of other ways you can work with fear and trauma, but these are fairly simple for most people to do with their animals. Systematic desensitization is simply when you take whatever is triggering your horse's fear response and you break it down into its smallest tolerable level. And then you introduce it little bit by little bit, getting a little bit more intense every time until the horse can cope with it being quite intense. We call this generating a kind of trigger hierarchy, if you like. Where you start with the lowest level of the trigger and then you slowly work up below the threshold for panic until the horse can cope with the presence of the trigger. And this, how quickly you can do this depends very much on the horse. And remember, if they are traumatized, you are not going to have as linear path along your desensitization, and they may have reoccurrences of their fear and you'll have to go back a couple of steps. To show systematic desensitization, I've got a little video here.
When you want to get it.
So this is a little pony we were starting. She's a rescue pony. She'd undergone neglect, but she doesn't actually show too many signs of trauma. But here we are working on desensitizing her to the numbner. I'm also using a clicker training so you can see the counter conditions a bit to get her used to me flapping the numbner about. At this point, she was comfortable being on her back, and I'm just working up the hierarchy. And she's also getting used to moving around with the numbner on her back. This is all quite new to her at this point, but as you can see, she is tolerating it at this level. Just getting her used to the feel of the numbner on her back. That is desensitization, and I just work up from there.
Yeah.
Then introducing the saddle, well, a roller first and then a saddle, and that is kind of desensitization to tact, essentially. Okay. The second way that people can easily work with horses is through counter conditioning. So counter conditioning, you are aiming to change the horse's emotional reaction to something. So let's say your horse is scared of plastic bags. If you pair the plastic bag or associate it with something pleasant for the horse, like food, then eventually the horse will appreciate seeing the plastic bag because they'll associate it with the occurrence of something they like. So it's a fairly simple thing. Remember, you have to be well below threshold for this to work. If the horse is panicking and you're trying to shove an apple in their face, that is not going to work, and I'm sure we've all been there. So the horse has to be well below threshold for this to work. Remember, the stress system shuts down the digestive system. So that is a key point with counter conditioning. It won't work if you pushed your horse too far. However, it can be very successful.
Yes.
If you are good. I'm afraid me and my sister chat a bit during these videos. So this is videos of this little pony Cinders doing a combination of desensitization and counter conditioning in getting her used to the mounting block this time. So this is her first couple of times approaching the mounting block with me on it. And I'm just slowly working towards her being comfortable with lining up to the mounting block and then with me leaning over her. I work at liberty because I want her to be there by choice. This means when I eventually get on the horse, obviously I wasn't the one to get on Cinders.
So I guess this would be good to have a long target. Yes.
Talking about just a bit about where it was. And you can see here, she's starting to accept me leaning over her. So that was just the beginning of this process. And then I'll show you. Next slide. Go. This is later on. So she's had a few sessions of this now. And you'll see quite a big difference here. So even though the weather is inclement in this video, I can now drag the mounting block out without any response from her. I can line her up to the mounting block. She's going to come around and stand in front of me. I'm going to reward her for doing that. And you can see she's close enough that I could just get on there. And now she is fully comfortable with me leaning over. So we have dealt with her fear of the mounting block. She's now quite comfortable with it. And in fact, she likes seeing it because she knows she's likely to get clicker training. And here I'm just desensitizing her to more and more kind of scratches and movement over the other side of her. It's interesting that she actually spoke to something in the distance there and she chose to stay with me. I thought that was quite a nice moment rather than moving off, especially as I was quite far leant over. So if she moved off, I'd have probably ended up having to jump onto the floor. That's my sister's dodgy camera work. Sorry about that. I also desensitized the horse to further down the flank because obviously your legs when you're riding do sometimes move there. So this is again getting higher and higher up to that level of desensitization, and over the haunches as well, because no mount is perfect and occasionally people do catch the haunches when they mount. So see, she's much more desensitized here. She's quite happy to stand there. And then we did this with tack on, and then we put a rider on her and she's now riding away. So that is a couple of ways you can kind of work with desensitization and counter conditioning with triggers in order to create an animal who is happy doing what you want. And is also not experiencing the fear system being activated, which will allow those changes to slowly undo themselves. Within the horse world, one of the key things we need to start doing is to think in a kind of more trauma-informed way, because a lot of horses do experience trauma, and a lot of the behaviors we often see in them are due to them having been through these incredibly stressful events. So I think as part of the equestrian world, one of the most important things we can do is be aware of trauma and be trauma informed. And you guys have been excellent in showing up to this webinar and kind of listening to me ramble on about trauma because it's one of my pet subjects. And hopefully you will feel like you are more trauma informed now. And that is important because your training, if you understand the changes that trauma makes to the brain and how that manifests in behavior and learning, is going to be much more effective, and you're going to know what you're in for. If you're interested in learning more about this, I have a course out soon, now, in fact, you can sign up for it now with Understand Horses. And we are going to be training people in how you can be trauma informed and how you can work with horses with trauma in much more detail. Thank you so much for listening. Sorry I ran over a bit. I gave myself way too much to talk about. But yeah, if you want to look me up, I'm on Understand Horses, or I have my own social media, and I run a club through my Patreon where we do talks every month and kind of share ideas. Thank you for listening.
Wow, that was a lot of ground covered, Emma, and I think
I think I gave myself a bit too much there.
No, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you ever so much. That was so interesting. And just before I introduce Justine, I'm just going to shout out to everyone who is joining us. We've got a very international audience this evening. So we've got people from all over the UK, got Costa Rica, the Czech Republic, the USA, Latvia, Finland, the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, and Greece. So thank you very much, everyone who's tuned in this evening. Right, I'm just going to share my screen again and we will introduce Justine, who's going to join us for the discussion. Those of you who attend these webinars regularly will know that this is not Justine's first rodeo. We've worked out this is her third one. She's obviously glutton for punishment. So Justine is a certified horse behaviour consultant with the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants. She's registered with the accredited animal behaviour. She's a registered accredited animal behaviourist with the Animal Behaviour and Training Council and is one of the organisation's trustees. And she is the founder of Understand Horses, which is an online education platform, which Emma alluded to in her presentation. So welcome, Justine.
Hello, thank you very much for having me back. I feel very honoured. This is my third time.
We are delighted to have you. So Justine, we'll kick off with you. So how often do you observe signs of trauma in the horses you see for behaviour consultations?
This is really interesting because Emma's list, I think, probably describes most of the cases that I see. So just going through that, I am regularly asked to see horses that are avoiding a particular trigger, like not wanting to go into the arena where they've had a traumatic event, or they've been frightened previously, or somebody's hit them, being tacked up. And this could be even something like the horse is biting when the girth is being done up and trying to avoid that, but they are tied up, and so they're unable to escape that situation. Fear of the vet, the farrier, not wanting to hack out. Then moving on to, I'm asked to see a lot of horses that are aggressive or irritable. That all of a sudden they might become more spooky, which Emma alluded to. Lots of horses that are difficult to train. They may struggle to concentrate, or they might be hypervigilant in one context or in multiple contexts, in multiple environments. Sleep might be disrupted, changes in mood or appetite, that they're depressed, and again, that they're developing stereotypies. And I'm really interested by Emma saying that, you know, we've got these three types. We have acute trauma, which is a one-off event. I totally agree that this is going to be, I want to say, easier to treat because you have a really good idea of what the trigger is and the owner might know. So it could be, as Emma said, they've had an accident in a trailer, or they've been frightened or taken away on their own in the trailer. So then they don't want to load the next time. So it's very clear what the trigger is. But then we might have chronic trauma where we're having one or two maybe triggers that are experienced repeatedly. And that could be being isolated. It could be related to management, or it could be very abusive training happening repeatedly. And then we get the really complex problems that are multiple different triggers experienced repeatedly and incredibly difficult to manage those issues, I think. So the horses experience multiple different fearful triggers over a period of time. It can be difficult to ascertain what the triggers are. And of course, because it's happened over a period of time, I would say, I was going to say a rule of thumb, the longer that these triggers have been going on, the harder that the issue might be to resolve. But there will be some cases that it can be going on a while, and it can be quite easy to change. But as a rule of thumb, the longer the problem has gone on, the harder it's going to be to treat. So yeah, I think that list that Emma gave pretty much describes my workload.
Yeah. And I think it was really interesting, Emma mentioned that individual variation. So, you know, horses can go through similar experiences, but will have very different reactions.
Yeah, it's just like a human trauma response. So if you get two people and put them through the same sort of situation, you'll get two completely different psychological responses.
Yes,
and
absolutely. And I was going to say you could have two horses that are on the same yard or in the stable block, and let's say that they've been exposed to ridiculous fireworks next door, and then as a result of that, we've got one horse that becomes hypervigilant, incredibly anxious, and another horse that's carried on eating throughout that's not affected by it. Absolutely, and that's a really important point.
Yeah, because you get genetic propensities, and you get kind of their past history that informs their response. So yeah, it's all very very individualized. That's one thing about being trauma informed, I think, is that you have to be aware that it's not kind of one course for every horse. It's literally horses for horses. So you have to do something different with each one.
Definitely. So Emma, why is trauma such a kind of new concept in relation to horses?
Well, I think for some people it is. And I think for people working in particularly like rescue situations, it's not at all. People who have worked with highly abused horses have known for quite a long time, I think, that animals absolutely manifest trauma responses. I think there's now more and more research being done in the academic world. And in fact, if you I have my own study on stress and trauma out at the moment, which I always forget to mention. So I should have given you a link. But if you go to my Facebook page, I have a link to my study. So if you have half an hour free of your life, please go and do my study. But the academic kind of research that has previously only been kind of rodent models and people is now starting to bridge the gap a little bit, and we're starting to understand a little bit more about how it manifests in animals in a more practical way. And then I think for a long time, I mean, you still get people now denying the sentience of horses, even though animals were granted consciousness by the scientific community quite a few years ago now. Not as in we gave them consciousness, but in that we looked at the neurology and said, well, we can't say that they're not, they likely manifest some consciousness given what's going on with their brains. Yeah, I think it's a bit kind of two-sided, if that makes sense. For some people it is a new concept, and for some people it's been something they've been aware of for a long time.
Justine, if someone suspects their horse has suffered from trauma, when should they be reaching out for help?
I think as soon as possible. I think, and Emma's described so beautifully that this is, you know, these are physical changes that happen in the brain, and the sooner that we're going to start addressing them, the better. And there might be, as I mentioned, there might be one very obvious fearful event that's occurred that the owner is aware of. Let's say like an accident loading, or that they've been frightened by a dog out hacking, or a bike or a bus out hacking, and so they can clearly see a difference in their horse's behavior. Those are easy to spot and sort of act immediately. But I would also really urge owners to learn more about horse behavior and start recognizing the earlier signs of stress, like tension in the face, changes in posture, even things like just stopping on the way to the arena or turning away when tack is being brought, being very, I want to say vigilant and listening to their horse. I think sadly, too often horses will start to voice, for want of a better word, that they're struggling with what they're being asked. And the signs are being dismissed, and they might just be tied up then to be tacked up, or they will be pushed through, pausing on the way to the arena, or being reluctant to go forward, those kind of things. And so we start to see the behavior escalate, and the problem gets bigger and bigger. So that was a very roundabout way of saying the sooner they can address it, the better. But I would always say the first thing to do is to contact your vet and just make sure that there's nothing physical going on. And if they get a physical all clear, then call a behaviourist or email a behaviourist and ask their opinion. A lot of them you can have a chat over the phone, and you could talk about what the issue is before you book a consultation. But yeah, I would say the sooner the better. And really, if we can start looking out for those very early signs of stress and nip it in the bud, I want to say we're really thinking about prevention is key.
Yeah, completely agree. So Emma, how important is minimizing stress when weaning for helping horses become resilient to stresses in future?
So there is an awful lot of research now within both kind of animal-based neuroscience and human-based neuroscience, which shows that if you undergo a kind of aversive events when you are in those kind of formative years, that can have really quite great impacts on your neurological structure, and that will have even greater impact on your behavior than kind of things that happen later on to you, essentially. So making sure that those formative experiences around weaning, that they are as stress-free as possible for the horse is absolutely paramount if you want a horse that is well adjusted into the future. Because otherwise the horse, all those changes that we discussed previously, they are magnified if those changes occur before the kind of brain is fully formed. So it is really important that all weaning is done in as stress-free way as physically possible, and is done at an age appropriate, so when it's age appropriate as well.
Great, thank you. I have one last question for both Justine and Emma, but just before I pose that to you guys, for our audience, if you have got any questions, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A, and please use the upvote function so that we can organise our questions as we go. So my final question to both of you is, if you could make one change to the equestrian industry to minimise stress and the causes of trauma for horses, what would it be? Who would like to go first?
I don't mind. You go, Emma. You go, Emma.
I would like to see, I think, a lot more evidence-based information going around. There's an awful lot of kind of information that isn't really well evidenced and is a lot of the time detrimental or counter to what we know to be kind of scientifically valid. So I think that would be a really big step forwards. And then if we could also start to become comfortable with things like LEMA, which is least intrusive, minimally aversive when working with our animals, things like that would be amazing.
Fab. Justine?
Yeah, mine would be that people learn to listen to their horse and to be able to recognize early signs of stress. I think, very sadly, by the time people come to reach out to me or my colleagues, problems are much bigger than they need to be. And I think if we could start recognizing the early signs of stress and just stopping at that point, rather than pushing horses to do too much or pushing them through fearful experiences and then as having a really traumatic situation, that would be fantastic.
Lovely. Right, thank you both very much. I'm going to jump into the audience Q&A now. So Kelly has asked, can horses completely recover from trauma? Can we reverse the changes within the brain? Emma, I think that's probably best posed to you.
Yes, they can certainly reduce significantly. Whether they ever completely go away depends on how severe the changes were. So if you've got kind of one acute trauma and you deal with it fairly effectively and quickly, then yes, you can probably get to a point where they've completely gone away. If you've got a horse with extremely complex trauma, that's going to be a long path to getting to the point where the horse is fully rehabilitated, because you're literally trying to undo physiological changes and neurological ones. So it's a much longer path. People want a quick fix, and I'm afraid that there isn't really a magic wand trauma. Just as any human who's experienced trauma will know, it's a long path to healing, but it can be done. You can get to the point where the horse is comfortable with their triggers, that their emotional responding is pretty much back to normal, it can definitely be done. The little pony I showed you at the beginning, she was actually quite cuddly by the end of her life, and she once kicked me on the backside so hard I couldn't sit down at school. So and by the end she was really cuddly. She was a lovely mare by the end. She was very handleable by the end. She was a sweetheart. So certainly you can get to a point where the horse is certainly comfortable, has high welfare, and is relatively reliable in their emotional responses. And that's as good as you can ask for.
Great, thank you. So Beth has asked, can you give us some other resources, so studies, books, people to follow regarding trauma in horses for those who would like to learn more?
So I think this is actually quite difficult, and one of the reasons why I put so much effort into this, because if I didn't come from a background in neuroscience and could understand the scientific literature, I think there's not really many good kind of, I don't know what you call them, kind of science books that aren't for scientists, if that makes sense. There's not really any good kind of practical guides, which is why I did the course with Justine. So little is written on it, and there's also actually relatively few studies in kind of domesticated pet animals. A lot of it is still kind of rodent research. So the amount of good resources available is actually surprisingly low. There's better ones in humans, and a lot of the human stuff is transferable. So maybe I'll try to put together a kind of list of some good ones, and then I can shoot them across to you, and you could put them up for people, because they are few and far between, sadly. There's not like a really good book on equine trauma that I can just give to you. I could plug my own course, but that sounds a bit...
I think you're allowed to plug your own course.
I think we need to ask Emma to write a book on. I think that,
there's some good ones, but just not specifically in horses.
there was a really nice study that you shared the other day, which was about trauma-informed training in dogs.
Oh yeah, there was a recent one came out about trauma-informed training in dogs. Because even in dogs there isn't that much, and they're usually ahead of us by about 20 years. So yeah, there's now a few in dogs looking at trauma with regards to kind of their emotional responses and stuff like that. But there's surprisingly little still, but it's getting more and more. So I'll try and dig out some good ones that I think are relevant, and I'll try to put together a little list.
I was just going to add to that. Oh, sorry, Emma. I was just going to add to that and say, yeah, I don't know of any really good resources either. But from a human perspective, I would recommend going to look at the YouTube channel of Bessel van der Kolk. I'm sure that Emma will add him to the list, but he's got a very good book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is excellent, which is about trauma in humans, and well worth reading, even though it's not about horses. But
yeah, a lot of the stuff is transferable though, because the changes occur in evolutionarily very old areas of the brain which are there in horses. So that's why there's symmetry. Now they won't get so much of the kind of cortical sort of symptomology, but certainly that's why there's sort of a crossover.
Fab, thank you. Alison has asked, can horses get trauma from loss of companions? I've had my horse for 22 years and unfortunately he has lost several companions throughout that time, and I'm convinced this has led to a trauma response. Justine?
Yeah, the horse, sorry.
No, well, I was going to say, I would be very interested to see what Emma says. I've met a lot of horses that have lost long-term friends, and I am absolutely convinced that they grieve horrendously. In some cases, it's really hard for them, and I don't see why why there wouldn't be trauma. I'd be interested to hear what Emma says. But I think what's incredibly sad is we tend to move horses quite regularly, and this is something that's just not really considered. And so many horses are stoic and will, I hate this term, but I want to say shut down, or we don't see a response. They might just, the only thing the owner might see is that they might stay away from the other horses, or they might graze less, or they might be a bit off their food. But I think they're really, really deeply affected. So I'm going to say to Emma, do you think that that would cause trauma?
Yeah, so any very stressful event can potentially cause trauma. So if the horse is particularly stressed by the loss of a companion, then absolutely that can cause a trauma response in that animal. And obviously, if it's happened several times, then you have the kind of build-up of the trauma as well, and more complex trauma is coming into play. So yeah, absolutely. And there is actually more and more evidence on grief in animals as well, which for a long time was kind of dismissed. But now we know certainly there's work done in elephants grieving, and some certain other species. So there's more and more work being done on animal grief, which is quite interesting.
Thank you. So Kelly's asked another question about trauma and early instant weaning. We did touch on this briefly, Emma, but she has asked, what can the effects be, and how can we help horses that have experienced this?
So the effects, again, will be quite individualized to the animal. I would add that you can get odd bonding behavior in horses that have been weaned very early, on top of that list that I gave in the talk. Kind of almost like hyperbonding or separation anxiety, that sort of thing, I found is quite common if a horse is weaned early or roughly. So those are the kind of, but the other changes will look relatively similar to the ones that I've already discussed. So hypervigilance, or potentially being very withdrawn, or aggressive behaviors you sometimes see. So anything like that can be an indication. You could also look for disturbance in sleep patterns, because obviously foals sleep a lot. And if you're not seeing that, then that will really affect their kind of their well-being. And the other one was, how do we work with them? And again, it's creating that space of safety. So that would be also, you need to concentrate on like social safety, because otherwise you can end up with horses with quite severe separation anxiety. So you're looking at re-establishing stable relationships for that animal. And this is very difficult to do in the current economic climate, where we're all forced onto livery yards, and it's all a bit difficult. And things change a lot. But if you can create an environment with very kind of stable relationships between the animals, that will help a lot, particularly during the horse's kind of teenage years. So that would be a really helpful thing to do. And then everything else would be kind of similar to what I already spoke about.
Can I just add to that? Do you know what? I don't even know where to begin with this one, because I think this is massive. I think this is a huge issue in the horse industry, and I must see a lot of horses that are really affected by incredible or horrendous weaning experiences. So I was just going to say that naturally that a mare might wean their foal somewhere between 9 and 18 months, maybe. And in some cases, the foal might be around a year after that. So it could be 2 or 3 or even longer. I'm seeing horses that are coming from different breeding establishments that are being weaned at 3 months old. And they may be weaned by being put on a lorry and taken away, or by being locked in a stable. And so that immediate separation, rather than gradual separation, where the mare and the foal have got the opportunity to become confident apart. And so I see lots of problems related to almost the nature of the weaning. So I've seen horses that will not load because perhaps they have been weaned by being loaded in the first place. I saw one horrendous case where a 2-year-old had come over from Ireland and had been weaned by being put on a lorry and then put on a ferry. And they really struggled to get her to load again, unsurprisingly, really. But also, as Emma said, huge number of problems with separation anxiety, and as Emma said, hyperbonding, but also then problems with horses that are very fearful of other horses, that really struggle being in close proximity to others. If we're talking about competition horses, I see a lot of them that have been weaned and kept separately, isolated, and then the only time the owner is going to realize that there's a problem or that they're fearful of other horses might be when they're in the warm-up arena, when they're in very close proximity and they're expected to trot or canter or jump right next to another horse. So we've got lots of social issues going on there. But also, if they've been shut in a stable, I'm asked to see horses that don't want to enter stables. Again, completely understandably, because that's where they've been locked up and separated from their mum and experienced that really traumatic event, being locked in that situation. So I think probably Emma and I could talk about this for some time.
A whole nother webinar.
Yeah. Look at that. Just say, I think it's really interesting to look at the kind of natural weaning process of feral and wild horses as well, because it really gives you an idea of just how different what we do is to what they would do if left to their own devices. So I think looking at wild instances of weaning, which often happens very late, is very informative.
Right, I'm going to move on because I do feel we could probably discuss this for a lot longer, and we have got an inordinate amount of questions to try and get through in the next 20 minutes or so. Karenza has asked, what reward do you recommend for a pony that is too excitable around food, Justine?
Something very low value. You can try using things like dandelions. I use massive handfuls of chaff. So something very low value, chopped lucerne or something like hi-fi or something like that. I always feed big handfuls of food because I want them to be chewing as long as possible. But you can use anything that's low value. I've had clients that use celery or lettuce even. I'm just trying to think what else.
I always say to my clients that a chewing horse is a happy horse.
Yes, absolutely. And things like hay cobs. There are some great feed companies that have large, I want to say nuts or pellets that are made of hay, and they're really great. They're a great reward. It doesn't have to be something really arousing like carrots or something sugary.
Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not anything too sugary, because you'll be overstimulating the dopamine system.
Fabulous. Grace has popped a question in. She says, hello, I've owned my Welsh Section D for 7 years and he has been scared of the vet or injections since before I owned him. We're unsure of his past, so don't know if he has had a bad experience with the vet. I have done some clicker training with him and can imitate the action of an injection with a pen with no fear response. However, he returns to his fear response as soon as the vet attempts this. Is this something that will come with time? Should I continue with his clicker training or will his trauma stay in his memory?
It suggests the trigger is something around the vet and not the injection. If you can basically do an injection on the horse and they're still having a massive response to the arrival of the vet, they're maybe responding to something else, additionally to the unpleasant sensation of getting injected. So what you'd really need to do is figure out what that trigger is, on top of kind of do all the cooperative care work with the clicker training, and kind of mimicking that injection. You could even get your vet to train you how to do an injection and see if that is an issue anymore for your horse. Some of them will do it. If he's fine with you doing it, it's just the trigger's something to do with the vet, and that's the trigger you would need to work with. Certainly, I don't think it's beyond hope. Just might need a bit more kind of work done around the triggers. I hope that helps.
It might be useful when the vet is on the yard to ask them to just turn up and go and give your horse a treat or a really nice wither scratch, and start pairing the vet with pleasant experiences, so that the vet doesn't turn up and automatically go straight in for the injection, as it were. But you could contact a behaviour consultant, and they could help you with a step-by-step plan with this. But I agree with Emma, it sounds like the vet is the trigger, and it could be vet smell of
the olfaction,
and all, you know, so it could be so the trigger could be something completely vet related that you would almost need to work out what that is. I've had clients that have asked for vet coats or vet outfits, and put vet outfits on and done that themselves. So it's getting a bit creative and thinking about what the actual trigger could be.
Brilliant, thank you. So Alicia has asked, how do diseases like PPID affect trauma? Emma?
So any kind of disorder that kind of changes the physiology of the horse can have an effect on how trauma manifests. We don't know really, is the answer, the exact kind of interaction between different disorders and kind of trauma, essentially, because the research isn't that in depth, particularly in horses. It's barely burgeoning as a research area. But certainly they can increase, things like PPID can increase kind of what you might call like an allostatic load, which is a concept of kind of how your stress response adapts to your environment. And if you've kind of already got a bit of a kind of load on your stress response, then everything else is going to send you up that trigger stacking a lot quicker. So that is probably the main way in which you're going to see differences in the trauma response. If they're struggling with an illness, that will play into that base rate of kind of arousal before you start introducing different kind of stimuli. So that's the main way you'll find that these things kind of interact with trauma. And then sometimes the hormones can interact well, but yeah, hopefully that helps.
Brilliant, thank you. Sue has asked, is there a way we can help with general trauma when we don't know what their triggers may be?
Absolutely. So basically the process would be exactly the same as I've described. You would have to kind of make sure they were in an environment where they felt safe. And then every time you observed their kind of emotional response to something, and it can help to write these down, because sometimes it's difficult to, if you keep like a diary, it's easier to see patterns. Some people are very good at spotting patterns anyway, but some people find it easier if they write it down, and you can kind of cross-reference. But you could then kind of build up an idea of what that horse's triggers are over a period of time, and how they relate to each other, how they trigger stack, how what calms those, is there kind of interacting factors which actually are calming for the horse if they're with another horse, for example. So yeah, if you don't know kind of the entirety of the horse's background, then really you need to use your skills of observation to generate a kind of catalogue of the horse's triggers. And then as long as your husbandry is okay and the horse is physically okay, and you've got all of that sort of husbandry out the way, you would then work with those triggers to try and reduce the horse's emotional response to them, kind of systematically, if that makes sense. So that would be the way I would go about it.
Brilliant. Sandija has asked, a horse is very sensitive to seeing shadows, new things in the arena, even though she's been in this arena for the past 2 years. The vet has checked her eyesight and everything is fine. Could this be trauma behaviour? Justine?
I would think potentially yes. It's very difficult to advise on a particular case because the horse might be anxious because we don't, I mean, Emma and I don't know what the horse's management is, or if that's something that's happened previously, or there could be something that is maintaining that behavior or that's worrying the horse that is actually in the arena environment that the owner is unaware of. But in a nutshell, I want to say yes, potentially it could be.
Oh, sorry, Emma, did you want to jump in?
I was just agreeing.
So Beth has asked, what are some of the ways that horses manifest social relationship disturbances behaviourally? Emma?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, my internet glitched.
Oh dear.
Sorry.
So Beth has asked, what are some of the ways that horses manifest social relationship disturbances behaviourally?
So this can be a myriad of different ways. So it can be in being completely withdrawn, it can be in bullying behavior, it can be in hyper bonding, it can be in resource guarding, it can be a myriad of different ways. You can get odd mating behavior, you can get all sorts of different disturbances to kind of normal social functions of horses. It can change their body language, which makes it difficult for them to communicate with other horses. If they've been very isolated as well in whatever they've gone through, that can affect that as well. So their communication might be off. So yeah, there's a myriad of different ways that it can manifest in horses, and that's not an exhaustive list, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Brilliant, thank you. Jackie says, thank you very much for this webinar. Would love to know if the skills and techniques learned in the trauma-informed horse trainer certification would work in tandem with positive reinforcement training.
Absolutely. So I do an awful lot, as you saw in the videos. I am very much a positive reinforcement trainer. I use clicker training. We also talk about a lot of different techniques that you can use to help your horse overcome triggers, and how to integrate kind of counter conditioning and positive reinforcement as part of that. We very much include positive reinforcement as kind of part of our working ethos, and when we're kind of considering how to work with the horse. And we obviously talk about kind of adapting it to different. Wow.
Brilliant.
So yeah, we'll definitely talk about it.
I've just had a look at some of the questions that we've got coming in, and I think just in the interest of time and to make sure that we get through as many as possible, I'm just going to go for some of the ones that are less case study based. So if you have got specific issues with your horses, I really do recommend that you reach out to a qualified equine behaviourist, have had them checked by your vet. And so for those of you who are giving us more case study type questions, please follow that route. But thank you very much for popping your questions in. So Catherine has asked, how does cortisol fatigue present in horses?
So cortisol fatigue is very lackingly studied, and so we don't really know, to be quite honest with you. I've only ever seen 1 or 2 studies that even mention it. There is a study out on, I think it was riding school, but I think it was more to do with stress than trauma, so I could dig that one out. And it looked at kind of the potential role of cortisol fatigue. It could basically, you're still looking for a maladaptive stress response. So anything that is maladaptive could be an indication of trauma being off. You might also see changes in metabolism, changes in immune system function. I saw someone mentioning ulcers, stuff like that. So cortisol fatigue suggests that the horse has had cortisol within their system for an awful long period of time. So you would really start to see the effects of that. And then basically has become disrupted. You can also, there is a theory as well that cortisol, a lack of cortisol in itself can be, because you then don't have an adaptive stress response, it's not functioning in the way it should, can also lead to an increase in the representation of trauma. So it can go both ways as well. So it may start off with, it may be the opposite is also true, that if you have a kind of slightly maladaptive cortisol response, that you're more likely to get trauma as well. So it goes both ways. But honestly, the research is so lacking in how these things manifest in the like more complex things like cortisol fatigue, how they manifest in horses. So really, you're looking for any indications of kind of a maladaptive stress response, essentially. So yeah, sorry, the research just isn't there.
No, it's brilliant, thank you. Justine, Beatrice has asked, learned helplessness, how often do you see this in the horses you treat? Can a horse truly recover from this, or will this always be a default setting?
What a brilliant question. I would say I see it relatively frequently, and it could be in different environments. It could be, I see it often when ridden, I think. Horses that have had a lot of punishment when they've been ridden, or very restrictive equipment, and they might have gone through a process of trying to voice their opinions about being tacked up, or being reluctant to be tacked up, and then they've been tied up and basically forced to be tacked up, and almost immediately they will adopt a kind of depressed posture and be reluctant. I want to say reluctant to go forward, but yeah. So I do see it. I do see it in different contexts. Can it? So the question was, the question has disappeared now. Can it ever truly be resolved? I want to say yes, but and certainly I've helped owners with a number of horses that have experienced this, that we've seen massive changes, massive improvement, and I think we've got them to a very good place. But I do wonder if they went, if those triggers were represented, what would happen? But because of course we're aiming for the owner not to put the horse in that position again. So the short answer to that is actually I don't know. But brilliant question.
Emma, have you got anything to add to that one?
I kind of would just second what Justine said there, to be honest. I think learned helplessness and withdrawal in horses, and any kind of tonic ability sort of a response that you see from them sometimes, they're usually quite deeply ingrained. So just like more complex traumas, they can take a long time to come out of that behavior, and you may also see the reoccurrence of that behavior more often than you would with some other behaviors. You may find that if the horse is put back in a situation which makes them feel stressed, that they may revert to that behavior as well.
Thank you. Anne has asked, can the increases in stress hormones like cortisol in a pregnant mare, have an effect on the unborn foal producing trauma in the foal?
Yes, so there's actually like quite a lot of research done on this now, on the kind of prenatal experience of humans and animals, and the effects on kind of brain structure and stuff like that. And it's one thing that I actually discuss on my course, is the effect of the kind of generational effect of trauma. And one of those generational effects, it's not just kind of due to kind of interactions and environment, it's also due to the kind of mother priming the baby for a stressful life, essentially, through cortisol. So we know absolutely that it does affect the unborn foal fetus, so, and other fetuses as well, and it is one part of what we call kind of generational trauma, and that can manifest in kind of more reactive stress responses in the babies and stuff like that. There's even research in wild animals now, looking at kind of if kind of wild animals in a stressful environment, then what are their children like? And you see through things like predation, actually, like and you do see changes occurring due to the kind of stress of mother.
Right,
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one last question from the audience. So Linda has asked, when identifying triggers, are we looking for flight or fight behaviour just normally or out of context?
So it would be in regards to a stressful event. So horses can have maladaptive stress responses for all kinds of different reasons, not just trauma. So what you'd be looking for is something that's being triggered by having gone through something very stressful. And that kind of manifesting in the changes. That makes sense. So if the horse has, to your knowledge, not been through something extremely stressful, then their behavior is due to, it may not be a trauma response, it might be due to something else. So that would be the key difference that you'd be there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma and Justine, and thank you to everyone who has popped questions.
Can I just say that if I haven't got to your question, if you pop across to my Facebook and write on my wall, sometimes I have time to do like little video answers. I do like little stupid video answers for people's questions. So if I haven't got around to answering, then feel free to pop any extra questions there. It sometimes takes me a while to get around to it though.
Can I just say that Emma's video answers are not stupid?
What an offer. Thank you very much. So just before we go, Emma, what would your take-home message for this evening be?
To look for those trauma responses and to become trauma informed so that you can understand that if the horse is manifesting those differences, that it's going to affect how you train them quite substantially. That would be my take.
Brilliant. Justine, how about you?
Yeah, I'm going to say weaning.
Yeah, weaning.
Back to weaning.
Well.
I'm gonna say that we really need to, in the horse industry, the equine industry, we really need to rethink weaning practices.
And backing.
And backing.
And backing. So much backing is done really badly.
And management.
Just a few things.
Just a few things, you know, all of it.
I think this has definitely spawned a few more webinars for our next series. Thank you very much to both of you. Just a reminder that in 2 weeks' time, we'll be joined by Sam Griffiths and Richard Davison to talk about how they manage their horses and how we can provide positive welfare for sports horses. Thank you ever so much again. If anyone has got any further ideas for webinars, please feel free to pop us an email at education@worldhorsewelfare.org. We are starting to plan next series, so any suggestions are more than welcome. Just massive thank you again, guys, and we hope to see everyone in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the brilliant questions.
Yeah, really good questions. Really, really thoughtful ones.